Elara Thorne had lived 20 years in absolute silence. Her father, a 4-star general who commanded armies, had consulted every specialist on Earth, only to be told her voice was dead. Then, a disgraced intern named Ivy walked in with a rusted tuning fork, and the chief surgeon ordered security to throw her out. What they didn't know was that Ivy had heard a secret note the machines missed. When she pressed that vibrating steel against Elara's throat, the result brought the general to his knees and forced the experts to admit they were wrong. The rain in Seattle did not simply fall, it conspired. It descended in gray, relentless sheets that turned the skyline into a watercolor painting left out in a storm, blurring the edges of skyscrapers until they looked like phantoms rising from the mist. The city felt submerged, breathing through gills of asphalt and concrete, heavy with the scent of pine and exhaust. To General Magnus Thorne, the weather was fitting. It was a shroud, a damp curtain drawn over a world that refused to give him the one thing he had spent 2 decades fighting for. He sat in the back of the black sedan, his posture as rigid as a steel beam. Even in a civilian trench coat, Magnus looked like a man wearing armor. He was 60 years old, carved from granite and discipline, with hair the color of gunmetal and eyes that had seen battlefields across 3 continents. Yet, the war he was fighting now, the war against the silence that held his daughter hostage, was the only campaign he had never been able to win. Beside him sat Elara Thorne. At 20 years old, Elara possessed a beauty that felt fragile, like a porcelain figure that might shatter if the world spoke too loudly. She had her father's dark, intense eyes, but where his were hardened by command, hers were deepened by isolation. Her raven hair was pulled back, revealing a neck she always kept covered with a silk scarf, as if protecting a wound that refused to heal. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the rain streak against the window, her expression unreadable. She was a girl trapped behind a glass wall, able to see the world, but unable to touch it with her voice. The car pulled up to the entrance of the Rainier Summit Medical Center. The building loomed out of the fog like a modern fortress of glass and steel, its upper floors disappearing into the low-hanging clouds. To Magnus, it did not look like a place of healing. It looked like the final objective. "We are here," Magnus said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the quiet cabin. Elara turned to him. She didn't nod. She simply met his gaze and offered a small, tired squeeze of her hand against his wrist. It was their code. "I am ready. I am tired. I love you." They walked into the lobby, the automatic doors parting with a pneumatic hiss. The air inside was sterile, smelling of antiseptic and floor wax. Magnus moved with a stride that forced people to step out of his way, his presence parting the sea of patients and nurses. He did not check in at the front desk. His arrival had been coordinated weeks in advance. This was the privilege of 4 stars on a uniform, even if that uniform was currently hanging in a closet in Virginia. As they waited near the elevators, the whispers began. 2 young residents stood near a nurse's station, glancing over their clipboards. One was tall and lanky, the other short with glasses. They spoke in hushed tones, but Magnus had spent a lifetime listening for the snap of a twig in a jungle. The acoustics of a hospital lobby were child's play. "That's him," the tall resident murmured. "The general. I heard he flew in from D.C. just for this." "A waste of jet fuel," the other replied, shaking his head. "I read the file. The girl has congenital laryngeal paralysis. The vocal cords are atrophied. It's like trying to teach a stone to sing. He's just a stubborn old man who can't accept he lost the war." Magnus's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge them. He simply placed a protective hand on Elara's shoulder. She flinched slightly, not from his touch, but from the vibration of the world around her. She picked up on everything. The shift in air pressure, the tension in a room, the way eyes lingered on her. They were ushered to a private waiting area on the 12th floor, a space reserved for high-profile cases. The room was quiet, furnished with plush chairs that offered no real comfort. The rain lashed against the panoramic windows, a constant drumming rhythm that filled the silence between father and daughter. Magnus pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his pocket and handed it to Elara along with a silver pen. This was their bridge. For 20 years, he had forbidden her from learning formal sign language. It was a decision that drew the ire of every therapist and educator they had ever met. To them, it was cruelty. To Magnus, it was a refusal to surrender. If she learned to sign, she accepted the silence. If she accepted the silence, the hope of a voice would die. So, they wrote. They wrote notes, they used gestures, they stared into each other's souls, but they never signed. Elara opened the book and wrote an elegant looping script. "Are you angry at the doctors downstairs?" She held it up. Magnus read it and sighed, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. "I am not angry at them, Elara. I am angry at their lack of imagination. They see a textbook case. I see you." Elara offered a sad, knowing smile. She began to write again, but a movement near the door caught her eye. A dog trotted into the room. He was a golden retriever, old and gray-muzzled, wearing a red bandana that read, "Therapy Dog," in white letters. His name tag, jingling softly against his collar, read, "Barnaby." He moved with a slow, heavy grace, his claws clicking on the linoleum. He didn't bark. He didn't jump. He simply walked past the general, ignoring the aura of authority that usually kept creatures at bay, and went straight to Elara. Barnaby sat down in front of her and rested his heavy head on her knee. He looked up at her with eyes that were liquid brown, ancient, and entirely free of judgment. Elara froze for a second, then melted. She dropped the pen. Her hands, usually so careful and contained, buried themselves in the dog's thick golden fur. She scratched behind his ears, and Barnaby let out a long, contented sigh that seemed to vibrate through the room. For the first time since they had landed in Seattle, Elara smiled. It was a genuine smile, one that reached her eyes and made the gloom of the rainy city retreat. There was no demand for speech here. The dog didn't care that her vocal cords were silent. He understood her touch. He understood her heart. Magnus watched them, a lump forming in his own throat. This was the tragedy of his life. He could command armies, he could alter the course of nations, but he could not give his daughter the simple ability to say hello to a dog. He felt a familiar cocktail of love and rage bubbling in his chest. Rage at the universe. Rage at the 73 specialists who had failed them before. "General Thorne?" The voice broke the moment. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Alden, the head of the diagnostic committee. He was a man in his 50s, balding, with a face worn smooth by years of delivering bad news. He wore a white coat that seemed too large for his narrow shoulders, and he held a thick file folder like a shield. "We're ready for you," Dr. Alden said. Magnus nodded. Elara gave Barnaby one last squeeze, her face falling back into its mask of stoic resignation as she stood up. The conference room was vast, dominated by a long mahogany table. 5 other doctors sat around it, a tribunal of white coats. They had the scans. They had the history. They had the verdict written on their faces before Magnus even sat down. The meeting proceeded exactly as Magnus had feared. Dr. Alden put up the digital scans on a large monitor. The images showed the anatomy of Elara's throat, ghostly black and white cross-sections of cartilage and tissue. "General," Dr. Alden began, his tone respectful but firm, tapping a laser pointer against the screen. "We have reviewed the records from Tokyo, from Berlin, and from Johns Hopkins. Our own preliminary assessment confirms their findings. The vocal folds are present, yes, but they are severely atrophic. They are immobile. The nerve signals simply aren't reaching the muscle tissue to create the tension required for phonation." Magnus sat stone still. "I know the technical terms, doctor. I want the solution." "There isn't one," a female specialist at the end of the table said softly. "The structure is biologically inert. It has been 20 years. The window for neural plasticity, it closed a long time ago." Dr. Alden took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "General, we understand your dedication, but continuing to drag Elara from hospital to hospital is creating a cycle of trauma. We strongly recommend you cease seeking surgical intervention." He paused, looking at Elara, who was staring down at her hands. "We have an excellent department for adaptive communication here. We can teach her American Sign Language. We can give her a synthesized voice tablet. It is time to help her live the life she has, rather than chasing a life she physically cannot have." The room fell silent. The only sound was the rain hammering against the glass, harder now, as if trying to break in. Magnus slowly stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a harsh sound that made two of the doctors flinch. He placed his hands on the table and leaned forward. He did not shout. He did not scream. He spoke with the terrifying quiet of a man who has ordered airstrikes. "You look at my daughter," Magnus said, his voice low and dangerous, "and you see a broken machine. You see wires that don't connect. You see a problem to be managed, a disability to be filed away." He walked around the table, stopping behind Elara's chair, placing his hands on her shoulders. She trembled slightly, feeling the heat radiating from him. "You asked me to accept silence," Magnus continued, his eyes locking with Dr. Alden's. "You tell me to give her a tablet that speaks with a computer's soul. You tell me to let her speak with her hands because you have decided her voice is dead." "General, medically speaking," Dr. Alden tried to interject. "Medically speaking, you are looking at a map and telling me the territory doesn't exist just because you haven't been there." Magnus cut him off, his voice rising, cracking like a whip. "I have heard her laugh in her sleep, doctor. I have felt the vibration in her chest when she cries. There is something there. Something you are missing because you are looking for a textbook definition instead of looking at the human being." He swept his hand toward the door. "You see a disabled young woman. I see a prisoner trapped in her own body. And as long as I have breath in my lungs, I will not teach her to decorate her cell. I will find the key. If you are not smart enough or brave enough to find it, then step aside." Magnus looked down at Elara. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't know if he was right or if he was mad with grief, but she knew he was the only one on Earth who refused to let the silence win. "Come, Elara," Magnus said, straightening his coat. "We are done listening to people who cannot hear." He turned and marched out of the room, Elara following in his wake, leaving the council of experts sitting in the stunned, heavy silence of the storm. The night shift at Rainier Summit Medical Center did not sound like silence to Ivy Chen. To everyone else, the hallways were quiet, broken only by the squeak of rubber soles and the occasional distant cough. But to Ivy, the hospital was a chaotic, discordant orchestra that never stopped tuning up. Ivy was 24 years old, small and wiry, with hair cut into a sharp, practical bob that framed a face defined by intense, intelligent eyes. She moved with a nervous, bird-like energy, her head often cocked to the side, as if listening to a frequency no one else could hear. She sat at the nurse's station, her eyes closed for a brief second, cataloging the noise. The refrigerator in the break room was humming a low G. The fluorescent light above her head flickered with a persistent, irritating buzz that sat exactly between C and C-sharp. The heart monitor in room 304 was beeping in a steady, rhythmic E-flat. "Earth to Chen," a voice cut through the symphony. Ivy snapped her eyes open. Nurse Miller, a senior staff member with a clipboard held against her chest like a breastplate, was frowning at her. "Are you meditating again? Or just sleeping with your eyes open?" "Listening," Ivy murmured, straightening her scrubs. "The regulator on the oxygen tank in 304 is loose. It's hissing, a high F-sharp." Miller rolled her eyes, a gesture Ivy had seen 1,000 times in her 6 months of internship. "The display is green, Ivy. The machine says it's fine. Stop trying to be a bat and just be a nurse. Check the vitals in the VIP suite." Ivy took the tablet without a word. She knew she was the odd one out. The other nurses gathered in clumps to gossip or scroll through their phones, but Ivy remained on the periphery. They trusted the digital readouts, the flashing lights, and the alarms. Ivy trusted the sound. She knew a patient's breathing was shallow before the pulse oximeter dropped. She knew a cough was wet before the pneumonia diagnosis came back. It was a gift, and it was a curse. She walked down the hallway toward the suite occupied by the general and his daughter. The rain was still hammering against the building, a percussive backdrop to the sterile hum of the floor. When she entered the room, the lights were dimmed. General Thorne was asleep in the armchair, his head tipped back, his formidable posture finally collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. Even in sleep, his brow was furrowed, as if he were strategizing a way to defeat the dark. Elara, however, was awake. The young woman stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, her silhouette framed by the city lights bleeding through the rain. She wasn't looking at the view. She was looking at the glass itself. Her forehead rested lightly against the cold pane, and her right hand was raised, her index finger tapping a rhythm against the surface. Tap, 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 Pause. Tap, tap. Ivy froze. Most people would have heard just a noise, a nervous tick of a sleepless girl. Ivy heard a time signature. It was a waltz, a slow, melancholic 3/4 time, tapped out with deliberate precision. Ivy moved closer, her footsteps silent on the linoleum. She didn't announce herself. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, she walked to the window, standing a few feet away from Elara. Elara didn't startle. She sensed the presence and turned her head slightly, her dark eyes catching the reflection of the city lights. She looked lonely, trapped in a glass box within a glass box. Without speaking, Ivy raised her own hand. She didn't tap the glass. Instead, she tapped her fingers against the hard plastic of the bed rail nearby, answering Elara's rhythm. Tap, 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 tap. She repeated the phrase, but then she improvised. She added a syncopated beat at the end, a little flourish of percussion. A question. Elara's eyes widened. She turned fully away from the window, staring at this small, strange nurse who wasn't asking for her blood pressure or offering pity. Elara raised her hand to the glass again. She tapped the new rhythm Ivy had created, then added her own variation, a faster, more complex triplet. Ivy smiled. It was a small, sad smile that tugged at the scar running across the back of her left hand. She tapped back, matching the triplet perfectly. For 5 minutes, they stood in the semi-darkness, trading rhythms. It was a conversation. It was the first time Ivy had seen Elara engage with anyone other than her father or the dog. The rhythm wasn't just noise. It was structure. It was language. Finally, Elara stopped. She looked at Ivy's hands, her gaze lingering on the jagged white scar that severed the muscle across the back of Ivy's left hand. It was an ugly mark, the legacy of a car door slamming shut on a hand that was once insured for $1 million. Elara pointed to the scar, then tilted her head in a silent question. Ivy instinctively covered the mark with her other hand. "I used to play," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the rain. "Violin, first chair at the conservatory. I heard the world in music before I learned to hear it in heartbeats." Elara's expression softened into profound empathy. She reached out and, for a brief second, touched the scar with a fingertip light as a feather. In that touch, an understanding passed between them. They were both musicians who had lost their instruments. Ivy had lost her hand. Elara had lost her voice. "Try to sleep," Ivy whispered. "The rain is loud tonight. It's a messy composition." Elara nodded and moved back to the bed. She lay down, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her eyes tracking Ivy as she checked the monitors. The general shifted in his chair, mumbling something about flank speed in his sleep. Ivy finished her rounds but didn't leave. She sat in the corner of the room, ostensibly updating the digital chart. But in reality, she was listening. She was listening to Elara breathe. The diagnosis in the file was clear. Complete paralysis of the vocal folds. Atrophy of the laryngeal musculature. Medically, this meant Elara's throat should be a hollow tube. Air should pass through it, like wind through an open window, smooth, unobstructed, silent until it hit the lungs. But that wasn't what Ivy heard. As Elara drifted into a deeper sleep, her breathing pattern shifted. It became heavier, slower. Ivy closed her eyes, shutting out the visual world to focus entirely on the auditory landscape. Whoosh, shh, whoosh. There was friction. It was faint, incredibly subtle, the kind of sound a machine would filter out as background noise. But to a woman with absolute pitch who had spent 20 years tuning violins to the microtone, it was a screaming red flag. If the cords were paralyzed open, there should be no friction. If they were paralyzed shut, she wouldn't be able to breathe. This sound was turbulence. It sounded like wind trying to blow through a crack in a door. It meant there was an obstruction, or tension. Ivy stood up and crept to the bedside. She leaned down, her ear inches from Elara's face. The smell of lavender shampoo and sterile linen filled her nose. Elara shifted in her sleep. Her REM cycle was beginning, her eyes darted beneath her lids. She was dreaming. A nightmare, perhaps. Her brow furrowed and her mouth opened slightly. Then, it happened. Elara made a sound. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a cry. It was a tiny strangled whimper caught in the back of her throat. To a normal person, It was just a sleep noise. But Ivy froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't just hear a noise, she heard a note. B-flat. It was a high, choked B-flat. Ivy's mind raced, connecting dots that the 73 specialists had missed because they were looking with their eyes, not their ears. You cannot produce a specific pitch with dead muscle. Dead muscle is flaccid. It has no tension. To make a B-flat, even a strangled one, the vocal cords had to be tense. They had to be vibrating. Elara whimpered again, a sharp, almost the same note. They are moving, Ivy thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a physical blow. They aren't dead. They are trying to speak. It sounded like a violin string that had been muted by a heavy velvet cloth. The vibration was there. The intent was there. The muscle memory was there. But something was physically dampening the sound before it could escape. Something was sitting on top of the cords, suffocating the resonance. Ivy looked at the sleeping girl with a mixture of horror and exhilaration. The general was right. The experts were wrong. The silence wasn't an absence of voice. It was a suppression of it. She needed to be sure. She reached out, her hand hovering over Elara's throat, wanting to feel the vibration. But she pulled back. She couldn't wake her, not yet. She needed proof. She needed to translate this sound into something the deaf world of medicine would understand. Ivy stepped back into the hallway, the sound of that strangled B-flat echoing in her mind. It was the saddest, most hopeful note she had ever heard. It was the sound of a prisoner banging on the walls of a cell, waiting for someone to hear the code. And finally, someone had. Dr. Silas Vane did not walk. He glided. He entered the procedure room with the polished aerodynamics of a man who had never encountered friction in his professional life. As the chief of otolaryngology at Rainier Summit, Vane was a celebrity in the medical world, a man whose articles were published in journals that sat on the desks of Nobel laureates. He was tall, with silver-streaked hair styled to perfection and hands that looked like they had been scrubbed raw and then dipped in expensive lotion. He wore a rimless pair of glasses that caught the harsh overhead lights, turning his eyes into unreadable discs of reflection. To Ivy, standing quietly in the corner, adjusting the instrument tray, he looked less like a healer and more like a CEO of a corporation that traded in human anatomy. "General Thorne," Vane said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, brief, and entirely lacking in warmth. "I've reviewed the overnight logs. No acute distress reported. Good. Let's not waste time." He turned to Elara. She was sitting on the exam chair, looking smaller than Ivy had ever seen her. The hospital gown she wore seemed to swallow her whole. Elara's eyes darted toward the equipment rack, where a high-definition stroboscopy unit hummed with a low, menacing energy. A long, flexible fiber-optic scope coiled on the tray like a black snake waiting to strike. "Miss Thorne," Vane said, snapping on a pair of latex gloves. The sound was sharp, like a pistol crack in the small room. "I'm going to insert a scope through your nasal passage to visualize the laryngeal structure. It will be uncomfortable. Do not move." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Just as Vane reached for the lubricant, a vibration buzzed through the room. It was a low, aggressive hum coming from the general's coat pocket. Magnus stiffened. He pulled out a secure satellite phone. The screen flashed red. Pentagon. Priority 1. The room seemed to hold its breath. Ivy knew what that call meant. It meant a crisis in a time zone 12 hours away. It meant decisions that cost billions of dollars and countless lives. It meant the world was burning, and it needed the general to hold the hose. Dr. Vane paused, the scope hovering in midair, looking annoyed at the interruption. "General, I need a sterile environment. If you need to take that..." Magnus looked at the phone. He looked at the red light flashing like a heartbeat. Then he looked at Elara. She was gripping the armrests of the chair so hard her knuckles were white, her eyes wide with terror as the black scope approached her face. She wasn't looking at the doctor. She was looking at her father. Magnus didn't hesitate. He didn't answer. He didn't step outside. He slid his thumb across the side of the device and powered it down completely. The silence that followed was heavier than the ringtone. "The world can wait," Magnus said, his voice absolute. "My daughter cannot." He stepped closer to the chair, taking Elara's hand in his own large, calloused one. "I am right here, Elara. Squeeze if it hurts. Vane cleared his throat, unimpressed by the display of paternal devotion. Head back, chin up. He guided the fiber-optic scope into Elara's nostril. Elara flinched, her eyes watering immediately. It was an invasive, violating sensation, a foreign object snake-crawling its way down the back of her throat. Ivy watched Elara's free hand clench into a fist, her fingernails digging into her palm. "Breathe through your nose," Vane instructed mechanically, his eyes glued to the high-definition monitor mounted on the wall. On the screen, the interior of Elara's body was revealed in 4K resolution. It was a landscape of pink mucosa and glistening tissue, and there, in the center, sat the vocal cords. They looked like two pale white bands forming a V shape. They were still, motionless, dead. "Okay," Vane said, manipulating the dial on the scope. "I need you to phonate. Say E, a long, high E." Elara opened her mouth. Her chest heaved. Ivy could see the panic rising in her eyes. This was the test she had failed 73 times. This was the moment the world demanded she perform a trick she didn't know how to do. "Say it," Elara's eyes seemed to scream. "Just say it." But nothing happened. On the monitor, the white bands remained frozen. They didn't approximate. They didn't vibrate. They sat there like stone pillars in a tomb. "Again," Vane said, his voice showing a hint of impatience. "Push air through them." "E!" Elara squeezed her father's hand so hard Ivy thought she might break his fingers. She squeezed her eyes shut. She pushed. She tried. Her diaphragm contracted, pushing air up from her lungs. Whoosh! Just air. Just wind rushing through a hollow tunnel. Dr. Vane pulled the scope back slightly, shaking his head. "Complete bilateral paralysis. Look at the atrophy on the thyroarytenoid muscle. It's paper thin. There's nothing there to work with, General." But Ivy wasn't looking at the vocal cords. She was watching the edges of the image. She was remembering the B-flat. She was remembering the waltz tapped on the glass. "Swallow," Vane ordered, preparing to withdraw the scope. "Clear the saliva." Elara swallowed. It was a reflex, a spasm of survival against the tube in her throat. On the screen, for a fraction of a second, less than a heartbeat, the entire structure shifted. As the epiglottis folded down to protect the airway, Ivy saw it. A ripple. It wasn't on the cords themselves. It was a tiny gelatinous shudder across the mucous membrane just above the cords. It looked like a sheet of plastic wrap catching a breeze. It rippled, shimmered, and then vanished as the swallow finished. "Wait!" Ivy blurted out. The word hung in the air, sharp and unauthorized. Dr. Vane froze. He slowly turned his head, looking at Ivy over the rim of his glasses as if a piece of furniture had just spoken to him. "Excuse me? Did you see that?" Ivy stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at the frozen image on the screen. Right there, when she swallowed, there was a ripple on the supraglottic tissue. Vane sighed, the sound of a man whose time was being wasted by a toddler. "Nurse Chen, that is called a secretion artifact. It's saliva moving over the lens, or a light reflection." "It wasn't saliva," Ivy insisted, her heart pounding against her ribs. She looked at General Thorne, desperate for an ally. "It moved in a wave pattern, saliva drips. This vibrated. General, last night I heard her make a sound. A B-flat. A high B-flat." Vane laughed. It was a short, dry sound. "A B-flat? Truly? We are conducting a medical examination, not a musical audition." "If there is a membrane," Ivy pushed on, the theory forming rapidly in her mind. "A congenital laryngeal web that is thin enough to be transparent. The camera light shines right through it. You can't see it because you're looking through it. But when she swallowed, the tension changed and it rippled. That's the resonance I heard." Vane withdrew the scope from Elara's nose with a quick, efficient motion. Elara gasped, coughing, her eyes red and streaming. "Nurse Chen," Vane said, stripping off his gloves and dropping them into the biohazard bin. "You are an intern. You have been here, what, 6 months?" "Yes, but I have performed over 4,000 laryngoscopies," Vane cut her off, his voice ice cold. He walked over to the sink and began scrubbing his hands, not even looking at her. "I have written 3 textbooks on laryngeal anatomy. What you were suggesting, an invisible web that 73 specialists missed, is not a diagnosis. It is a fantasy. He turned off the faucet and dried his hands with a paper towel, turning to face the general. General Thorne, the machine does not lie. The stroboscopy shows zero mucosal wave, zero vibration. The cords are atrophied. The visuals confirm the diagnosis of total paralysis. But the sound, Ivy whispered. Vane turned on her, his eyes flashing with genuine anger now. Medicine is based on what we see, Nurse Chen, not on what you imagine you hear in the middle of the night. Do not confuse your hallucinations with clinical data. He turned back to the general, dismissing Ivy entirely. I am sorry, Magnus. There is nothing to operate on. If we cut into that tissue, we risk destroying the little structural integrity that remains. She will never speak. It is over. Magnus stood there, holding his weeping daughter. He looked at the high-tech screen that showed a dead throat. Then he looked at Ivy. Ivy stood in the corner, humiliated, small and shaking. But her eyes were burning. She didn't look like someone who was wrong. She looked like someone who knew a secret that was killing her. Magnus looked back at Vane. You are sure? I am the best in the world, Vane said simply. I am sure. The silence returned to the room, but this time, it wasn't peaceful. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a door slamming shut for the last time. The instrument was not sterile. It did not come from a sealed plastic package, nor did it bear a barcode for hospital inventory tracking. It lay inside a small, battered case of midnight blue velvet that smelled faintly of pine rosin and pipe tobacco. Ivy sat on the bench in the locker room, her shift officially over, her career likely hanging by a thread. In her lap lay the object that had defined her childhood, a tuning fork. It was made of tempered steel, darkened by age and the oils of her grandfather's hands. It was heavy, unrefined, and ugly compared to the chrome instruments upstairs. But when struck, it sang with a purity that could cut through the noise of the world. A440, her grandfather used to say. The anchor of the universe. Everything returns to A. He had been a piano tuner in Shanghai, a man who could tell you the temperature of a room just by hearing how a C string went sharp. He had taught Ivy that machines measured capacity, but the ear measured the soul. Ivy closed the case and stood up. She wasn't supposed to go back to the VIP suite. Dr. Vane had dismissed her. The general was preparing for discharge. Logic dictated she go home, drink cheap wine, and update her resume. But the echo of that strangled B-flat from the night before was still ringing in her head, a ghost note that refused to resolve. She walked through the hospital corridors. The atmosphere had shifted. The storm outside had broken, leaving behind a heavy, humid stillness. Inside, the staff moved with the lethargy of a quiet afternoon. When she reached the suite, the door was ajar. The room was quiet. General Thorne was gone, likely downstairs signing the mountains of liability waivers required to check out a patient against medical advice, or perhaps finally answering the Pentagon's call. Elara was alone. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in civilian clothes, a soft gray sweater and jeans. Her bag was packed by the door. She looked like a traveler waiting for a train she didn't want to board. Her hands were folded in her lap, her head bowed. She looked defeated, emptied out by the hope Dr. Vane had surgically removed an hour ago. Ivy stepped inside and closed the door. The click of the latch sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Elara's head snapped up. When she saw Ivy, her expression shifted from surprise to a weary kind of pity. She knew Ivy had gotten in trouble. She knew the cost of speaking up. Ivy didn't waste time with pleasantries. She walked straight to the bedside table, pushed aside a pitcher of water, and placed the velvet case on the surface. She pulled out her notepad and a marker. She wrote in bold, jagged letters, "I am not crazy, and neither are you." She held it up. Elara stared at the words, then looked at Ivy. She reached for the pen, her movements slow, reluctant. She wrote back, "The machine saw nothing. He said it is dead." Ivy shook her head fiercely. She wrote again, "He looked with light. Light passes through glass. I listen to vibration. Vibration cannot lie." Elara read the note, and for the first time, a spark of irritation flared in her eyes. It was a good sign. Anger was better than resignation. She took the pen and wrote with harder strokes, the paper tearing slightly. "Why do you care? It is over." Ivy looked at the girl, the prisoner of silence. She thought about her own hand, the violin concerto she would never play, the music that had been stolen from her. She leaned in close, speaking softly, her voice urgent. "Because I know what it's like to have the music trapped inside," Ivy whispered, "and because last night you hummed a B-flat." Elara froze. She stared at Ivy, her mouth parting slightly. She shook her head in denial, grabbing the pen again. Her hand trembled as she wrote, "I didn't. I can't." Then she hesitated. The pen hovered over the paper. The truth was a terrifying thing to admit. But Elara wrote one more line, her handwriting small and jagged. "It hurts when I try. It feels like swallowing fire." Ivy read the note and felt a surge of triumph mixed with heartbreak. This was the missing piece. The doctors saw atrophy and assumed lack of sensation. But Elara felt pain. Ivy knelt so she was eye level with Elara. "Elara, listen to me," she said, her voice steady and hard. "Dead nerves don't feel pain. Scar tissue doesn't feel pain. Atrophy is numbness. If it hurts, it means the nerves are firing. It means the structure is fighting against something. Pain means it's still alive." Elara's breath hitched. She touched her own throat, her fingers tracing the line of her larynx. Tears welled in her eyes, not tears of sadness, but of terrifying possibility. Ivy stood up and opened the velvet case. She took out the tuning fork. It looked ancient against the sterile white of the hospital room, a piece of the old world invading the new. "This is calibrated to 440 hertz, Ivy explained, holding the U-shaped steel by its stem. "It's a standard A note, but it's not just a sound, it's a physical force. It creates sympathetic resonance." She wrote one last note, underlining it twice. "Trust me." Elara looked at the steel fork, then at Ivy's eyes. She saw the desperation there, the reckless belief that had already cost Ivy her reputation. Elara took a deep, shuddering breath. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Ivy didn't hesitate. She raised the tuning fork and struck it hard against the rubber sole of her shoe. The sound was immediate, a pure, unwavering tone that seemed to hang in the air like a silver thread. It wasn't loud, but it was dense. It carried energy. "Chin up," Ivy whispered. Elara tilted her head back, exposing the smooth line of her throat. She closed her eyes, bracing for pain, for a needle, for something invasive. Ivy moved the vibrating fork closer. She didn't hold it to Elara's ear. Instead, she pressed the base of the stem firmly against the center of Elara's thyroid cartilage, right over the Adam's apple. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Physics took over. The vibration from the steel transferred directly into the cartilage, bypassing the air, traveling through bone and tissue. It turned Elara's larynx into a soundboard. If the vocal cords were truly paralyzed and the airway clear, the vibration would have simply dissipated into the soft tissue, a dull, buzzing sensation. But there was something there. The invisible membrane, the laryngeal web that Ivy suspected, was stretched tight across the vocal cords like the skin of a drum. It was thin, tense, and waiting for energy. The 440 Hz frequency hit that membrane, and it reacted. It didn't just vibrate, it thrashed. Elara's eyes flew open, her hands flew to her throat. Her face turned a deep, alarming shade of crimson. The vibration wasn't just a sound, it was a physical assault on the obstruction. It tickled, it burned, it shook the very foundation of her airway. "Cock!" Elara doubled over, a sound exploding from her mouth. It wasn't a breathy exhale, it was a cough, a hard, wet, percussive cough. "Hack! Cock!" Ivy stepped back, her heart soaring. A cough was mechanically impossible without the vocal cords slamming shut and then blasting open to expel air. To cough like that, the cords had to move, they had to slam together. Elara was gasping, clutching her chest, coughing again and again as her body tried to expel the foreign object that was actually the vibration itself. Tears streamed down her face, her body shaking with the violence of the reaction. To anyone else, it looked like a medical emergency. To Ivy, It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "You're coughing," Ivy cried out, grabbing Elara's shoulders to steady her. "Elara, look at me. You are coughing. Paralyzed muscles can't cough." Elara wheezed, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Ivy, shock written on every feature of her face. The sensation in her throat was raw and stinging, but it was new. For 20 years, her throat had been a silent void. Now, it was on fire. The door to the suite burst open. General Thorne stood in the doorway, a stack of discharge papers in his hand. He froze, seeing his daughter bent double, face red, gasping for air, with the disgraced nurse standing over her holding a piece of vibrating steel. "What is the meaning of this?" Magnus roared, dropping the papers. They scattered across the floor like white leaves. He rushed forward, pushing Ivy aside with the force of a tank, placing himself between the nurse and his daughter. "Elara, are you okay? Did she hurt you?" Elara was still wheezing, her hand clutching her throat. She looked up at her father. She couldn't speak, not yet, but she shook her head frantically. She grabbed his lapel with one hand and pointed at her throat with the other. She looked at him with eyes that were wild, terrified, and undeniably alive. Then she did something she hadn't done in 20 years. She cleared her throat. "Hermph!" It was a small, gravelly sound, a sound of friction, a sound of two surfaces rubbing together. Magnus froze. He looked at his daughter, then he turned slowly to look at Ivy. Ivy stood her ground, clutching the old tuning fork like a weapon. "The machine didn't see it because it's transparent, General," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "But the sound found it. There is a web, a membrane. It's vibrating, and if it vibrates, we can cut it." The general looked at the tuning fork, which was still humming faintly in the silence of the room. He looked at Elara, whose face was flushed with the blood of exertion. He realized, with a jolt that nearly brought him to his knees, that for the first time in her life, his daughter didn't look like a porcelain doll. She looked like someone who had just been in a fight. And won. The elevator ride down from the 12th floor felt like a descent in a diving bell, the pressure building with every passing second. Ivy Chen tapped her foot against the metal floor, her heart beating a frantic, syncopated rhythm against her ribs. In her right hand, she gripped the handle of the antique tuning fork so tightly that the steel bit into her palm. The metal was still warm. It still held the memory of the vibration that had shaken Elara Thorne's throat. The vibration of life. She had to find Dr. Vane. She had to explain. He was a man of science. Surely if presented with irrefutable cause and effect, with physics that demanded an answer, he would listen. He had to. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to the grand atrium. Rainier Summit Medical Center did not have a lobby. It had a cathedral. The space was a soaring expanse of glass and Italian marble, designed to assure wealthy donors that their money was building a legacy. A massive sculpture of a DNA helix made of suspended crystal hung from the ceiling, catching the light of the rainy afternoon. And there, standing near the donor wall, was Dr. Silas Vane. He was not alone. He was surrounded by a small, immaculate orbit of important people. Leading the group was Senator Sterling, a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that produced politicians. He had silver hair that didn't move, a suit that cost more than Ivy's nursing school tuition, and a smile that appeared only when a camera shutter clicked. Beside him stood the hospital administrator, Mrs. Halloway, a woman with a face as sharp and cold as a scalpel, dressed in a severe navy blazer. They were laughing at something Vane had said, a polite, controlled laughter that echoed softly off the marble. Ivy stepped out of the elevator. She looked like a survivor of a natural disaster. Her scrubs were wrinkled from a double shift. Her hair was escaping its clip in wild, dark strands. There was a smear of ink on her cheek from her frantic note-writing, and her eyes were wide with the manic energy of discovery. She ran. Her sneakers squeaked violently against the polished floor, a harsh, rubbery sound that cut through the hushed atmosphere of the atrium. "Dr. Vane!" she shouted. The group turned. The laughter died instantly. Mrs. Halloway stiffened, her eyes scanning Ivy's disheveled appearance with immediate disapproval. Senator Sterling looked confused, stepping back slightly as if poverty might be contagious. Dr. Vane's face went blank, then hardened into a mask of irritation. He adjusted his rimless glasses, stepping forward to intercept her before she could reach the donors. "Nurse Chen," Vane said, his voice a low hiss. "This is neither the time nor the place. I am in the middle of a briefing with Senator Sterling regarding the new oncology wing." "It's not paralysis," Ivy gasped, coming to a halt 3 feet from him. She held up the tuning fork like a holy relic. "Dr. Vane, you have to listen. It's a laryngeal web, a congenital web. I proved it." Vane looked at the rusty, dark piece of steel in her hand with undisguised disgust. "You proved it? With that?" "Physics," Ivy insisted, her voice rising, desperate to make him understand the magnitude of what had just happened. "I used sympathetic resonance. I placed a 440 hertz frequency against her thyroid cartilage. She coughed, doctor. She coughed violently. You can't cough if the cords are paralyzed. You know the mechanics. The cords have to adduct to build subglottic pressure. She has movement." Mrs. Halloway stepped forward, her voice icy. "Dr. Vane, is this staff member intoxicated?" "No, she is—" Vane struggled to find a word that wouldn't embarrass the institution. "She is a junior intern who is having a mental health crisis." "I am not having a crisis," Ivy yelled, stepping closer. "I am telling you that you missed it. The machine missed it because the web is transparent, but the sound found it. She is in pain because the nerves are alive. You are sending a girl home to be mute forever when all she needs is a scalpel." The acoustics of the atrium amplified her voice. Patients in the waiting area looked up. The receptionist stopped typing. Then, chaos arrived on 4 legs. Barnaby, the golden retriever, had apparently slipped out of the elevator before the doors closed. He came bounding across the marble floor, his claws scrabbling for traction, barking a deep, joyous woof at the sight of Ivy. The dog skidded into the group, his tail wagging like a metronome set to allegro. He bumped into Senator Sterling, leaving a smear of dog drool on the politician's immaculate trouser leg. "Good God!" Sterling exclaimed, brushing at his pants. "Is this a hospital or a kennel?" "Barnaby, no!" Ivy cried, trying to grab the dog's collar, but the tuning fork got in the way. The scene was a disaster. The disheveled nurse, the barking dog, the drooling politician, and the frantic shouting about invisible webs. Dr. Vane's composure snapped. The vein in his temple throbbed visibly. He was the chief of surgery. He was a man of science. He was trying to secure a $10 million grant, and this girl, this nobody with a piece of scrap metal, was ruining everything. "Enough!" Vane roared. The sound was so loud that even Barnaby stopped barking and sat down. Vane lunged forward and snatched the tuning fork from Ivy's hand. He held it up, his face twisted in a sneer. "You dare!" Vane spat, shaking the instrument in her face. "You dare come down here, interrupting a critical meeting, shouting about sound waves and invisible membranes? You are questioning 73 specialists with this?" "It's an instrument," Ivy pleaded, tears pricking her eyes. "It's my grandfather's. It works." "It is a toy." Vane turned to a medical waste cart that a porter had paused nearby, watching the spectacle. On the side of the cart was a red plastic bin marked Sharps, Biohazard. "This is not medicine, Nurse Chen," Vane declared, his voice echoing through the atrium. "This is voodoo. This is superstition. It is dangerous, unscientific garbage." With a flick of his wrist, he threw the heavy steel tuning fork into the biohazard bin. Clang! The sound of the metal hitting the plastic bottom was final. It was the sound of Ivy's heritage, her proof, and her career being discarded like a used syringe. Ivy gasped, taking a step toward the cart, but Vane blocked her path. "You are done," Vane said, his voice trembling with rage. "You are fired, effective immediately, for harassment of a patient, for insubordination, and for practicing pseudo-medicine on hospital grounds." He turned to the security guard standing near the entrance. "Get her out of here, now, and take the mutt with you." "You're wrong," Ivy whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "You're wrong, and you're letting your ego blind you." "Get her out!" Vane screamed. 2 burly security guards grabbed Ivy by the arms. They weren't gentle. They viewed her as a threat to the peace. Ivy didn't fight them physically. The shock had drained the fight out of her limbs. She looked back at the red bin, at the place where her grandfather's soul lay among the trash. As they dragged her toward the sliding glass doors, Barnaby trotted after them, his tail tucked between his legs, sensing the defeat. They shoved her out into the rain. The automatic doors hissed shut behind her, sealing the warmth and the light inside. Ivy stood on the wet pavement, the rain instantly soaking through her thin scrubs. She was shivering. She had no job. She had no proof. She had lost the only thing that connected her to her music. Inside the glass, she saw Dr. Vane smoothing his suit jacket, turning back to Senator Sterling with an apologetic, charming smile, as if he had just swatted away a particularly annoying fly. The world of power and prestige had won. The fortress of silence remained breached, but the gatekeeper had thrown away the key. The suitcase zipper made a sound like a tearing seam in the quiet of the VIP suite. General Magnus Thorne packed with the efficiency of a soldier breaking camp, folding Elara's clothes into neat military squares. He was a man in retreat. For the first time in his career, he had sounded the call to fall back. The hospital room felt contaminated now. The air was thick with the residue of false hope and the ugly scene in the atrium. Magnus blamed himself. He had allowed a desperate young nurse to manipulate his daughter's emotions, leading to a spectacle that had humiliated them all. He had failed to protect Elara's dignity. "We are leaving Elara," Magnus said, his back to her as he latched the suitcase. "The jet is fueled. We will be in Virginia by tonight. We will find a new path, a quiet path." He turned around, expecting to see her sitting obediently by the door. She wasn't there. Elara was standing in the center of the room. She was trembling, but not from fear. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and burning with a frantic intensity he had never seen before. Her hands were clenched at her sides, opening and closing in a rhythm of frustration. "Elara, please," Magnus said, his voice softening. "I know this was hard. I know you were disappointed, but that woman, she was unstable. She hurt you." Elara moved. She didn't walk. She lunged. She grabbed Magnus's wrist with both hands. Her grip was shocking in its strength. She pulled him, dragging his heavy arm toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the elevator that led down to the rain-slicked street where Ivy Chen had been exiled. "Elara, stop," Magnus commanded gently. She shook her head violently. She let go of his wrist and brought her hands to her throat. She clawed at the skin over her larynx, her mouth opening in a silent scream. Then she pointed at the door again. She grabbed the notepad from the bedside table, the one Ivy had written on. She flipped to a blank page and wrote with such force that the pen tip tore through the paper. "She heard me." She shoved the paper into her father's chest. Magnus looked at the jagged letters. He looked at his daughter. He saw the way she was breathing, ragged, deep breaths that seemed to catch on something in her chest. He remembered the sound she had made when he burst into the room, that friction, that gravelly clearing of the throat. "You believe her," Magnus whispered. It wasn't a question. Elara nodded. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. She grabbed his hand again and placed it on her throat. She forced a cough, a small, painful hacking sound. Ka-ack. Magnus felt it. Under his palm, the vibration was undeniable. It wasn't the hollow rush of air through a dead tube. It was a collision. It was a struggle. The realization hit him like a mortar round. The specialists had shown him pictures of a quiet landscape. Ivy Chen had shown him a battlefield, and Magnus Thorne understood battlefields. He looked at the suitcase. Then he looked at the door. The resignation in his posture evaporated, replaced by the steel spine of a man who had commanded the 1st Marine Division. "Stay here," Magnus said. The tone was different now. It wasn't the voice of a worried father. It was the voice of a general. "Do not pack another thing. We are not retreating." He turned and walked out of the suite. He didn't head for the elevators. He headed for the stairs. Mrs. Victoria Halloway, the hospital administrator, sat in her office on the top floor. It was a sanctuary of beige leather and mahogany, insulated from the smell of sickness and the noise of the wards. The rain lashed against her window, but inside, the climate was controlled and serene. She was on the phone, massaging her temple. "Yes, Senator. I apologize again for the K9 incident. The staff member has been terminated. Security has removed her from the premises. It was an isolated breakdown. We are reviewing our hiring protocols immediately." She looked up as her office door opened. Her assistant, a young man named Peter, who wore bow ties to look older than he was, stood there looking terrified. "Ma'am, I tried to stop him, but—" Peter was gently moved aside by a hand that looked like it could crush a brick. General Magnus Thorne stepped into the office. He closed the door behind him, cutting off Peter's stammering. Mrs. Holloway slowly lowered the phone. She didn't stand up. She was used to powerful men. She managed a board of directors worth billions. "General Thorne," she said, her voice crisp and cool, "I was just about to call you. I assume you are here to discuss the refund of your deposit? Given the unfortunate display by our former nurse, I am prepared to offer a full—" "I am not here for money," Magnus said. He walked to the center of the room. He didn't sit in the guest chairs. He stood in front of her desk, looming like a thunderhead. "I am here for the nurse," he stated. Holloway let out a short, incredulous breath. "Nurse Chen? She has been fired, General. She assaulted you. She harassed your daughter with a piece of scrap metal. She is a liability." "She is the only person in this building who did her job," Magnus said. Dr. Vane looked at a screen. "That girl looked at my daughter." "Dr. Vane is a world-renowned surgeon," Holloway countered, her patience thinning. "Nurse Chen is an intern with a history of insubordination. General, I understand you are desperate for a cure, and grief makes us grasp at straws, but we cannot allow—" Magnus reached into the inner pocket of his coat. Holloway flinched, her eyes widening. For a second, she thought he was reaching for a weapon. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with a primal kind of danger. But Magnus didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a small rectangular box wrapped in worn leather. He opened it and placed it gently on the polished mahogany of her desk. Inside lay a medal. It was a gold star suspended from a blue ribbon, surrounded by a wreath of green laurel leaves. The Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration that could be awarded to a member of the United States Army. Holloway stared at it. "General, I earned this in the Korengal Valley," Magnus said softly. His voice was calm, which made it terrifying. "We were pinned down. We were outnumbered. Intelligence said the ridge was clear. The satellites said the ridge was clear. My radio operator, a kid from Iowa named Miller, said he heard movement. The experts told me he was imagining it. They told me to stick to the plan." Magnus leaned forward, placing his knuckles on the desk, leaning over the metal. "I listened to the kid. We changed our route. The patrol that took the original path, the path the experts approved, was wiped out. Every single man." He looked Holloway in the eye. "I have spent my life fighting for the truth. Sometimes the truth is on a satellite map. Sometimes it is in the ears of a terrified private. Today the truth is in the hands of a girl you just threw into the rain." "General, this is a hospital, not a battlefield," Holloway said, though her voice wavered. "It is a battlefield," Magnus corrected. "You are fighting death, and you are losing because of arrogance." He straightened up, buttoning his coat. "Here is what is going to happen. You are going to bring Nurse Chen back. You are going to authorize a re-examination of my daughter, not a standard exam. You will do exactly what that nurse asks." "I cannot do that," Holloway said, trying to regain her authority. "Dr. Vane would resign. The protocol—" "If you do not," Magnus interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, "I will make it my mission to dismantle this institution brick by brick." He pointed a finger at the window, toward the city of Seattle. "I know every senator on the Appropriations Committee. I play golf with the owners of the 3 largest media networks in this country. If I walk out of here, by tomorrow morning, the headline on every screen in America will not be about your new oncology wing. It will be, Rainier Summit Medical Center denies treatment to disabled veteran's daughter to protect ego." Holloway went pale. She knew the power of narrative. She knew that a 4-star general claiming negligence was a PR nuclear bomb that no amount of donor money could fix. "You would destroy our reputation over a hunch?" she whispered. "I would burn the world down for my daughter," Magnus replied. "Do not test me on this." The silence stretched out, tense and brittle. Holloway looked at the medal on her desk, the symbol of a man who did not bluff. She looked at the general's face, etched with the granite resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. She slowly reached for her desk phone. Her hand was trembling slightly. "Get me security," she said into the receiver, her eyes never leaving Magnus. And page Dr. Vane. Tell him to meet us in the operating theater, immediately." She hung up and looked at Magnus. "If she is wrong, General, if she is wrong, I will sue you for everything you have." Magnus picked up his medal and slipped it back into his pocket. "If she is wrong, Mrs. Halloway," he said, turning to the door, "you won't have to sue me. I'll be the first one to apologize. But if she is right, you had better pray she is forgiving." Ivy Chen was dripping wet. The security guard who had dragged her out 10 minutes ago had found her sitting on a bench at the bus stop, staring into the rain. He hadn't apologized. He had simply said, "They want you back upstairs," with the confused urgency of a man who realized the hierarchy of the universe had just inverted. Now she stood in the scrub room of Operating Theater 4. Her sneakers squelched on the tile floor. Her hair was plastered to her skull. She was shivering, adrenaline and cold warring for control of her limbs. "Here," a nurse said, thrusting a pair of fresh, dry scrubs at her. "Hurry, Dr. Vane is waiting." Ivy changed with fumbling hands. She didn't look in the mirror. She didn't need to see the fear in her own eyes. She grabbed the velvet case containing the tuning fork from the counter, where the security guard had unceremoniously dumped it. It was the only credential she had left. When she walked into the operating theater, the atmosphere was pressurized. It felt less like a medical facility and more like a bomb disposal site. Dr. Silas Vane stood by the operating table, his hands gloved and raised in the sterile position. His face was a mask of cold, controlled fury. He didn't look at Ivy. He looked through her. "We are proceeding under duress," Vane announced to the room, his voice clipped for the recording microphone. "Patient Elara Thorne. Re-evaluation of laryngeal structure per administration directive. Note that the attending surgeon considers this procedure unnecessary and potentially traumatic." Elara lay on the table. She was sedated but conscious, a twilight state. Her eyes were half open, glassy and unfocused, darting around the room until they landed on Ivy. Ivy moved to the head of the bed. She ignored Vane's hostility. She looked down at Elara and squeezed her hand. Elara's fingers twitched in response. "I am here." "Okay," Ivy said. Her voice cracked, then steadied. "I need the lights dimmed, and I need the fiber optic light source detached from the camera scope. We are going to use it manually." "That is unorthodox," Vane snapped. "The camera needs the light source too." "We aren't using the camera yet," Ivy interrupted. "We are using physics." Up in the observation gallery, separated by a wall of thick glass, General Magnus Thorne stood like a statue. He was leaning forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He watched the small, dark-haired nurse command the room against the giant of modern medicine. He didn't know the medical terms, but he knew what courage looked like. Down below, Ivy took the tuning fork out of the case. "Dr. Vane," Ivy said, "I need you to position the light source against the side of her neck. External transillumination. We need the light to cut across the vocal cords horizontally, not vertically. We need to create shadows." Vane hesitated. For a moment, it looked like he might throw the instruments down and walk out. But he looked up at the gallery. He saw the general. He saw the end of his career staring back at him. "Do it," Vane ordered the circulating nurse. The nurse pressed the high-intensity light wand against the skin of Elara's neck, just below the jawline. The room lights were killed. In the darkness, Elara's throat glowed with a ghostly reddish translucence. "Now," Ivy whispered. She struck the tuning fork against the metal railing of the bed. The sound filled the silent room. A pure A440. Ivy pressed the stem of the fork against Elara's thyroid cartilage, exactly as she had done in the bedroom. "Watch the airway," Ivy commanded. The vibration traveled through the cartilage. Elara's body reacted instinctively. Even through the sedation, the irritation triggered a spasm. She gagged slightly. Her throat muscles contracted. "Look," Ivy pointed. Dr. Vane leaned in, peering through his surgical loops into Elara's open mouth. At first, he saw what he always saw, the pale, immobile V-shape of atrophied vocal cords. But then, the light angle shifted, the tuning fork vibrated, and reality tore open. Because the light was coming from the side, and because the vibration was shaking the entire structure, something caught the beam. It was impossibly thin, a veil of tissue, a gossamer sheet of clear congenital membrane that stretched across the vocal cords like plastic wrap over a bowl. It was completely transparent under direct light, invisible to the camera's head-on flash. But under the side light, shaking with the resonance of the tuning fork, it shimmered. It rippled like a soap bubble. Dr. Silas Vane stopped breathing. He blinked. He leaned closer, his nose almost touching Elara's face. He adjusted his loops. There it was. A laryngeal web, type 3, covering 90% of the glottis. It held the vocal cords prisoner, glued together, unable to move, unable to vibrate, unable to breathe fully. The silence in the operating theater was total. It was heavier than the silence of the last 20 years. Vane slowly straightened up. His hands, usually steady as rocks, were trembling. He looked at the phantom membrane shimmering in the red glow of the transillumination. He looked at the anatomy he had written textbooks about, realizing he had been reading the map upside down for decades. "Dr. Vane," the anesthesiologist whispered, breaking the spell. Vane didn't answer immediately. He looked across the table at Ivy Chen. The intern was pale, wet, and exhausted. But she wasn't gloating. She wasn't smiling in triumph. She was crying. Silent tears tracked through the rainwater on her face. She was looking at Elara with a love so fierce it made Vane look away. "Scalpel," Vane said. His voice was different. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, mechanical focus. "Sir?" the scrub nurse asked, confused. "We aren't prepped for—" "I said scalpel!" Vane barked, his voice cracking. 15 blade, micro scissors. Now, put her under. General anesthesia, deep. We are operating. The room exploded into action. The anesthesiologist pushed the propofol. Elara's eyes closed as she drifted from twilight into the deep dark. The intubation tube was prepped, but Vane waved it away. "Jet ventilation? I need the field clear. I am not losing this." Up in the gallery, Magnus Thorne saw the shift. He saw the moment the doctor became a surgeon again. He saw the scramble for instruments. He slumped against the glass, his legs finally giving out, sliding down until he was kneeling on the floor, watching his daughter's life change through a pane of glass. Vane worked. He worked with a ferocity that was almost penitent. He inserted the laryngoscope, locking the jaw open. He brought the microscope into position. On the large monitors, everyone could see it now. The web, the enemy. Vane took the micro scissors. His movements were precise, elegant, the movements of a master who had finally been given the right sheet music. He positioned the blades at the posterior edge of the web. Snip. The tension in the room released with the tension in the tissue. As the membrane was severed, the vocal cords, white, pale, and seemingly dead, sprang apart. They recoiled like rubber bands that had been stretched too tight for too long. They weren't dead. They were just bound. And then, the blood came. It wasn't a hemorrhage. It was a single dark ribbon of crimson that welled up from the incision line. It flowed over the white cords, staining them with the shocking color of life. "Suction," Vane murmured. The blood was cleared. The cords sat there, free. They looked raw. They looked weak. But they were separate. The airway was a gaping, beautiful black hole leading down to the lungs. Vane finished the cut. He smoothed the edges. He applied a topical mitomycin to prevent regrowth. He worked for 40 minutes in absolute silence, sweating through his cap. Finally, he pulled the instruments out. "Procedure complete," Vane said. He stripped off his gloves and threw them into the bin, the same bin where he had thrown the tuning fork. He walked over to Ivy. The room watched. The nurses, the techs, the general up in the gallery. Vane looked at Ivy. He looked at the wet scrubs, the messy hair, the defiance that had saved a life. "You were right," Vane said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but he spoke them clearly. "I missed it. We all missed it." Ivy looked at him, clutching her tuning fork. "You fixed it," she said softly. "That's what matters." "No." Vane shook his head, looking back at the sleeping girl on the table. "I just held the knife. You found the ghost." He turned and walked out of the OR, his shoulders slumped. A king who had lost his kingdom but saved his soul. Ivy stayed. She reached out and touched Elara's shoulder, The monitor beeped a steady rhythmic cadence. Beep, beep, beep. It sounded like music. It sounded like a B-flat resolving into a C major chord. The symphony of silence was over. The overture of the rest of her life had just begun. Recovery Room 4 was a place of suspended animation. The air conditioning hummed a low, constant drone, scrubbing the air of the metallic scent of blood and replacing it with the sharp tang of antiseptic. Elara Thorne drifted in a white fog. Time was not a line, but a loop, circling back on itself. She felt heavy, as if gravity had doubled its hold on her limbs. But the center of her universe was her throat. It didn't feel empty anymore. It felt raw. It felt like she had swallowed a handful of broken glass and fire. She blinked, her eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks like the wings of a tired moth. "She is coming around," a voice whispered. It was a familiar voice, a safe voice. Ivy. Elara forced her eyes open. The harsh fluorescent lights had been dimmed to a soft amber glow. The first thing she saw was her father's hand. It was resting on the bed rail, close to hers but not touching, as if he were afraid that even the weight of his fingers might break the spell. Magnus Thorne looked like a ruin of a man. The general who had stared down enemy battalions and hospital administrators had vanished. In his place sat a father who had aged 10 years and 2 hours. His tie was loosened, his top button undone. His eyes were red-rimmed, sunken into dark hollows of exhaustion. He wasn't looking at Elara's face. He was watching the rise and fall of her chest, terrified that it might stop. "Elara," Magnus whispered. His voice was cracked, a dusty sound. Elara tried to nod, but the movement tugged at the incision inside her throat. She winced, a sharp hiss escaping her lips. "Easy," Ivy said, appearing in Elara's field of vision. She looked washed out, her hair drying in frizzy waves around her face, but her eyes were bright. "Don't try to move your head. You're sore. That's good. Sore means the nerves are waking up." The door to the recovery room opened softly. An elderly woman shuffled in. She wore the navy blue uniform of the custodial staff, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun that couldn't hide the kindness in her face. This was Mrs. Gable. She had been cleaning the floors of Rainier Summit for 30 years, invisible to the doctors who walked past her, but she saw everything. She saw who cried in the chapel. She saw who threw things in anger. Mrs. Gable walked up to the bedside table. She didn't say a word. She simply reached into the deep pocket of her apron and pulled out a velvet box. It was stained with a smear of something red, likely from the biohazard bin, but it had been wiped clean. She placed the box gently next to the water pitcher. She patted Ivy on the shoulder, a firm, motherly tap, and then turned to General Thorne. "You take care of that girl, General," Mrs. Gable said, her voice sounding like dry leaves. "And you," she looked at Ivy, "you keep making noise." She shuffled out before anyone could thank her. Ivy picked up the velvet box. She opened it. The tuning fork lay inside, cool and dark and waiting. It had been thrown away as trash, but it had returned as a scepter. "Elara," Ivy said softly, "Dr. Vane is here." Elara shifted her gaze to the corner of the room. The chief surgeon stood in the shadows, his arms crossed, his white coat pristine again. But his posture slumped. He stepped forward into the light. He didn't look like a god anymore. He looked like a man who had realized his hands were just hands. "The surgery was successful," Vane said quietly to the general. "The membrane is gone. The vocal cords they are structurally sound." He looked at Elara. For the first time, he made eye contact with her, not as a patient file, but as a person. "I apologize," Vane said. The words seemed to cost him a great deal of effort, dragging out of his throat. "I let my certainty become a blindfold. If not for Nurse Chen," he trailed off, shaking his head, "I almost silenced you forever. I am sorry." Elara looked at him. She didn't smile, but she blinked slowly. It was an acceptance, a dismissal. Ivy moved closer. She checked the monitors. Heart rate 85, oxygen saturation 99%. "Okay," Ivy said. "We need to test the engine, but we aren't going to drive the car yet. We're just going to turn the key." She took Elara's hand. "Do not try to speak words. Words require tongue, lips, breath control. It's too much. I just want a sound, a hum, like we did with the tuning fork. Remember the vibration? Elara panicked. Her eyes widened. The fear that had lived in her for 20 years roared to life. What if it's not there? What if the pain is all there is? What if I open my mouth and the silence is still louder than I am? She looked at her father. Magnus leaned in. He took her hand, engulfing it in his warmth. Elara, he whispered, you don't have to be afraid, even if there is nothing. I am still here, but you have to try. For yourself. Elara closed her eyes. She focused on the feeling in her throat, the raw, burning sensation. Ivy had said pain meant life. She took a breath. It felt different. The air didn't just rush down a tube. It felt like it was filling a chamber. She pushed the air up from her diaphragm the way she had tried 1,000 times before. But this time, she imagined the gate was open. She tightened the muscles in her neck. It was faint. A tiny groaning vibration. Ivy gasped. Magnus stopped breathing. It sounded like an old door hinge rusting open after a century. It was low, guttural, and undeniably human. That's it, Ivy encouraged, her voice thick with emotion. That's the chords. They're touching, they're vibrating. Do it again. Push a little harder. Elara opened her eyes. She felt the vibration in her teeth. She felt it in her chest. It was a physical sensation she had only ever felt by touching other people. Now, it was coming from inside her. She looked at Magnus. She saw the tears standing in his eyes, held back by a dam of military discipline that was about to burst. She didn't want to hum. She didn't want to make a noise. She wanted to call him. She licked her dry lips. Her tongue felt heavy. She shaped her mouth. Puh. The sound was an explosion of air. It hurt. God, it hurt. It felt like tearing stitches. Don't force it, Ivy warned gently. But Elara ignored her. She squeezed Magnus's hand so hard her fingernails dug into his skin. She summoned every ounce of will, every year of silence, every note she had written on paper, every scream she had swallowed. She looked right into her father's gray, terrified eyes. Pa! The syllable cracked. It broke in the middle. It was raspy, ugly, and wet. Magnus's mouth fell open. A single tear escaped, tracking through the lines of his weathered face. Elara took another breath, fighting the sob that threatened to choke her newfound voice. Pa! Papa! The word hung in the air, more powerful than any command Magnus Thorne had ever given. It shattered the last of his armor. The general crumpled. He didn't just cry, he broke. He buried his face in the mattress beside her hip, his shoulders shaking with violent, racking sobs. He wept for the 20 years of silence. He wept for the battles he had almost lost. He wept with the sheer, crushing weight of gratitude. Elara reached out with her free hand. She stroked his gray hair, her own tears flowing freely now, hot and cleansing. She opened her mouth again, testing the miracle. She croaked, the sound barely a whisper. Love, you. Magnus looked up, his face wet, his eyes shining with a light that rivaled the sun. He kissed her hand, pressing it to his cheek. I heard you, he choked out. Elara, I heard you. In the corner, Silas Vane turned away, unable to watch the raw intimacy of the moment. He slipped out the door, a shadow leaving the room to the light. Ivy stood by the monitor for a moment longer. She watched the heart rates of father and daughter synchronize on the screen. She watched the way Elara's chest rose and fell, not just with breath, but with voice. She looked down at the velvet box in her hand. She closed her fingers around the cool steel of the tuning fork. She wasn't needed here anymore. The bridge had been built. The prisoner had been freed. This room was now a sanctuary for two, and she was an intruder in their joy. Ivy smiled, a genuine, tired, radiant smile. She placed a hand over her heart, bowed slightly to the weeping general and his speaking daughter, and backed out of the room. The automatic doors of Rainier Summit Medical Center slid open. Ivy Chen stepped out. She expected the cold slap of rain, the gray misery of Seattle that had greeted them when this started. But the storm had broken. The clouds were parting in the west, torn open like wet cotton to reveal a bruised golden sunset. The pavement was still wet, reflecting the city lights like a mirror, but the air was clean. It smelled of ozone and washed pine. Ivy took a deep breath. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the tuning fork. She held it up to the dying light. It was scratched, old, and stained, but it was unbroken. She struck the fork against the metal railing of the ambulance bay. The note rang out. A perfect A440. It drifted out into the city air. It mingled with the distant sound of a ferry horn from the Puget Sound, a low, mournful B-flat. It mixed with the hum of traffic and the rustle of the wind. Ivy closed her eyes and listened. The hospital behind her was no longer a fortress of silence. It was just a building, and somewhere on the 12th floor, a new note had been added to the symphony of the world. She opened her eyes, tucked the tuning fork back into her pocket, and began to walk home. The music was everywhere, and for the first time in a long time, Ivy Chen was ready to play her part. The Symphony of Silence reminds us that the loudest truths are often the ones no one else can hear. In a world full of noise and experts telling us what is impossible, it takes courage to listen to the quiet whisper of hope. Like General Thorne, never stop fighting for the ones you love, even when the whole world tells you to surrender. And like Ivy, trust your instincts. Your unique perspective might just be the key to someone else's miracle. If this story brought a tear to your eye, or hope to your heart, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about the resilience of the human spirit. Let us pray. May God grant you the ears to hear the unspoken needs of those around you and the courage to speak life into hopeless situations. May every wall of silence in your life be broken, and may your homes be filled with the sounds of joy and healing. If you believe in miracles, type Amen in the comments below. God bless you.